June 16, 1943, marked a pivotal moment in Port Moresby, New Guinea, as the first rays of the tropical sun barely crested the formidable Owen Stanley Range. At this early hour, Captain J. Zeamer Jr. ignited the four powerful Wright Cyclone engines of his B-17E bomber, an aircraft officially designated for 1266, though universally recognized by its evocative nickname, Old 666. The formidable machine idled at the runway's edge, its fuel tanks brimming for an arduous 10-hour journey, and its ammunition bays packed with enough ordnance to ignite a significant conflict. Conspicuously absent, however, was any form of protective escort. Zeamer was poised to embark on an audacious journey, traversing over 1,000 miles deep into the most heavily fortified Japanese airspace in the Pacific. He was accompanied by a meticulously chosen crew of 9 volunteers, each acutely aware that their chances of returning were perilously close to nil. The mission briefing had been delivered with stark clarity. Allied intelligence urgently required detailed reconnaissance photographs of Buka and Bougainville, strategically vital islands in the northern Solomon Islands. Japanese forces were rapidly constructing airfields in these locations, and General MacArthur's strategists needed precise intelligence regarding the enemy's capabilities before initiating the ambitious Operation Cartwheel. The inherent challenge was formidable. Buka lay approximately 600 miles within hostile territory, defended by an estimated 400 Japanese fighters operating from numerous airfields. Conventional military doctrine mandated fighter escorts for photo-reconnaissance missions, yet the immense distance rendered this impossible. No Allied fighter aircraft in the Pacific possessed the operational range to complete the round trip. Consequently, a single aircraft would be compelled to venture forth alone, flying at a consistent, unhurried pace essential for photographic accuracy, and relying solely on its defensive capabilities should the Japanese forces engage. This perilous mission had already been rejected by 3 distinct flight crews. Official military records euphemistically describe these refusals as decline due to tactical concerns, but the unvarnished truth was far simpler. Experienced aviators, after meticulously analyzing the maps and calculating the overwhelming odds, had unequivocally informed their commanders that this was not a mission but rather a suicide run with extra steps. They argued that piloting a heavy bomber unescorted over enemy strongholds at predictable altitudes and speeds, necessitated by the photographic equipment of 1943 requiring stable platforms, was an invitation to disaster. The Japanese would undoubtedly detect their approach from as far as 50 miles away, allowing ample time to scramble every Zero fighter within range, leaving the bomber with no sanctuary and no support. It was at this critical juncture that J. Zeamer's name emerged as a potential solution. His selection was not primarily because he was considered the squadron's most proficient pilot, though by this point his skills were arguably unparalleled. Rather, Zeamer had cultivated a formidable reputation for undertaking missions that others vehemently avoided and, against all expectations, consistently returning. He had previously piloted Old 666 on perilous mapping expeditions over previously uncharted regions of New Guinea, always maintaining a precarious lead over Japanese patrols. His crew's loyalty to him bordered on an almost religious fervor. Furthermore, his bomber was no ordinary B-17. Through months of diligent scavenging, ingenious modifications, and what the maintenance crews affectionately termed creative engineering, Zeamer had meticulously transformed Old 666 into the most heavily armed bomber operating in the Pacific theater. When headquarters presented him with the Buka mission, Zeamer exhibited no hesitation. He meticulously scrutinized the charts, precisely calculated fuel consumption, conferred extensively with his trusted crew, and, ultimately accepted the assignment. His decision was not driven by a death wish, nor by an underestimation of the inherent dangers. Instead, it was motivated by the grim reality that 9 Allied aircrews were currently stranded in the treacherous waters surrounding Bougainville, having been shot down during previous operations. These brave men were now hiding from Japanese patrols, desperately awaiting rescue. The reconnaissance photographs from this mission would furnish rescue coordinators with invaluable intelligence, pinpointing enemy positions, identifying safe routes, and designating viable pickup points. These critical images could ultimately spell the difference between survival and certain death for nearly 100 men. Thus, on that fateful June morning, Zimmer and his crew boarded Old 666, meticulously performed their pre-flight checks, and commenced their roll down the runway at Port Moresby. The control tower offered a solemn wish for good hunting. No one uttered the customary, "See you later," as the bomber ascended and veered northward, gradually vanishing into the coastal haze. A palpable sense of apprehension settled over the ground crew, many of whom silently questioned whether they had just witnessed 10 men depart to their demise. To fully comprehend why J. Zimmer ultimately undertook the mission that every other crew had unequivocally refused, one must first understand the extraordinary circumstances through which he acquired Old 666. This narrative transcends a mere account of the military's most accomplished personnel being equipped with the finest machinery. Instead, it chronicles the remarkable journey of an overlooked pilot inheriting a neglected bomber, and through sheer, unyielding refusal to acknowledge limitations, transforming both into enduring legends. Zimmer, a distinguished MIT engineering graduate prior to the war, earned his pilot wings in 1941. He arrived in the Pacific Theater in 1942, possessing exceptional flying skills, but experiencing profoundly unfortunate timing. His original crew was disbanded before they ever flew a single combat mission together. Command subsequently reassigned him as a backup pilot, essentially a spare, meant to fill in when regular pilots were incapacitated or on leave. For a man who harbored fervent aspirations of flying combat missions, this demotion was deeply humiliating. Months drifted by, marked by Zimmer's assignments to cargo runs, mail delivery, and occasional transport missions, never the true combat engagements he yearned for. The fundamental issue, as perceived by his superiors, was Zimmer's propensity for strong opinions. He frequently challenged tactics he deemed inefficient and proposed aircraft modifications that mechanics had not requested. He dedicated his off-duty hours to meticulously studying Japanese fighter tactics rather than engaging in card games with his fellow pilots. Within the rigid hierarchical structure of military aviation, this unconventional behavior branded him as a troublemaker. A personnel report from early 1943 noted that while Lieutenant Zimmer was technically proficient, he demonstrated insufficient deference to established protocols. This was, in essence, officer parlance for this individual believes himself superior to his commanding officers, and no one wishes to contend with such an attitude. Then, Old 666 entered the picture. The bomber had sustained severe damage during a mission in early 1943. Its original crew miraculously managed to limp back to Port Moresby. A subsequent damage assessment revealed numerous fuselage breaches, a partially annihilated tail section, and engine malfunctions that would necessitate weeks of extensive repairs. The aircraft was technically salvageable, albeit barely. It was subsequently towed to the distant end of the airfield, a designated area where damaged aircraft awaited parts, attention, or eventual scrapping. For most pilots, Old 666 would have remained an invisible wreck, merely one more broken bird among dozens. Zimmer, however, perceived an extraordinary opportunity. He approached his commanding officer with a bold proposition. "Permit me to repair it, and allow me to retain it. I will form my own crew, execute our own missions, and remain entirely out of everyone's way." The response was essentially a dismissive, "Sure, whatever," the kind of perfunctory permission granted when no tangible results are anticipated. Consequently, Zimmer set to work with unwavering determination. He recruited a bombardier named Joe Sarnowski, a kindred spirit and fellow outsider who, despite his considerable skills, had also been relegated to non-combat roles. Subsequently, waist gunners, a radio operator, and a navigator joined their ranks. All were men who had been overlooked, underestimated, or were simply weary of waiting for their rightful opportunity to prove their mettle. Together, they meticulously rebuilt Old 666 from the ground up, but Zimmer's efforts transcended mere factory specifications. He transformed it into something the original Boeing engineers could never have envisioned. A standard B-17E typically carried 13.50 caliber machine guns. Zimmer, however, added an additional 6, meticulously scavenging weapons from other damaged aircraft and ingeniously installing them in custom positions. He reinforced the nose section with robust armor plating, a modification technically against regulations, but one that went unchecked. He ingeniously modified the bomb bay to accommodate extra ammunition instead of its maximum bomb load, shrewdly reasoning that in photo reconnaissance missions, bullets would prove far more valuable than bombs. He even installed supplementary guns capable of firing directly downward through the fuselage, thereby safeguarding the vulnerable belly area where most Japanese fighters typically launched their attacks. The maintenance crews considered him obsessive, while other pilots jested about Zimmer's flying porcupine. Yet, when Old 666 finally rolled back onto the active flight line in May 1943, it was an unparalleled bomber in the Pacific. Due to the extensive additional weaponry and armor, it weighed considerably more than standard B-17s and was consequently technically slower. However, in a combat scenario, it possessed the capability to unleash more defensive firepower than bombers twice its size. Zimmer had masterfully channeled his engineering acumen and months of simmering frustration into a decisive tactical advantage. By June 1943, Zimmer and his crew had successfully completed enough mapping missions to unequivocally demonstrate their competence, not as outstanding heroes, but as an unconventional assembly of misfits, who consistently performed solid work and avoided trouble. This precise reputation was why, when headquarters required someone for a mission fraught with terrible odds and devoid of glory, their thoughts turned to the unconventional troublemaker pilot and his unique, Frankenstein-like bomber. After all, should the mission prove disastrous, they would not be sacrificing their most valuable personnel. The arduous flight to Buka spanned nearly 4 hours, and for the majority of this duration, a strange sense of calm prevailed. Old 666 hummed northward over the glistening Solomon Sea at an altitude of 25,000 feet, sufficiently high to evade most anti-aircraft fire, yet low enough to obviate the crew's need for constant oxygen. Zimmer meticulously kept the engines throttled back, conserving every precious gallon of fuel, knowing they would require every drop for the return journey. Navigator Ruby Johnston diligently worked his charts, relaying precise course corrections. Radio operator Forrest Dillman assiduously monitored frequencies, listening intently for any indication that Japanese radar had detected their presence. In the nose compartment, Bombardier Joe Sarnowski made the final, intricate adjustments to the cameras, meticulously checking angles and exposure settings. A palpable tension permeated the aircraft, but it was the controlled, manageable tension characteristic of seasoned professionals engaged in exceptionally difficult work. Then, at approximately 0900 hours, they reached the designated photography run over Buka. Zimmer skillfully descended to 20,000 feet and meticulously leveled out for the critical camera pass. This segment represented their most vulnerable moment. For the photographs to be of any practical utility, Old 666 was compelled to fly straight and level, maintaining exact altitude and speed. No evasive maneuvers, no deviation whatsoever. They simply had to hold steady while the cameras meticulously captured image after image of Japanese airfields, formidable gun emplacements, and vital supply depots below. This critical photographic run would consume approximately 6 minutes. 6 agonizing minutes of being a slow-moving, exposed target deep within hostile enemy airspace. The crew of the reconnaissance aircraft, known as Old 666, found themselves in a perilous situation, having penetrated deeply into hostile airspace. Barely 3 minutes into their crucial photographic mission, the watchful eye of waist gunner William Vaughan detected an ominous threat. Numerous dark specks rapidly ascending from the vicinity of Kahili airfield. After a swift, double check to confirm his count, he urgently activated his intercom. "Fighters approaching from the 5 o'clock high position. Skipper, it appears to be an overwhelming force. I estimate at least 15, possibly 20 enemy aircraft." Captain Zimmer, the pilot, responded with an almost unnervingly calm and conversational tone. "Ruby, how much time do we have before they intercept us?" Navigator Johnston, with practiced efficiency, quickly calculated. 3 minutes, perhaps 4, Captain. Zimmer offered a silent nod, unseen by his crew. "Joe, what's the remaining duration for our photographic sweep?" Sarnowski, the bombardier and photographer, verified his equipment. "Another 3 minutes for a comprehensive photographic record." At this critical juncture, Zimmer faced the inevitable dilemma that plagues every commanding officer: abort the mission immediately, retreat to safety, and leave their objective unfinished, or steadfastly maintain their course, complete the assignment, and confront the impending onslaught. For Zimmer, the notion of retreat was never a serious consideration. "All gunners, prepare for engagement. We are completing this photographic pass." Throughout the aircraft's fuselage, the gunners methodically chambered their rounds and meticulously scoured the vast expanse of the sky. The distant specks rapidly expanded, their forms resolving into the unmistakable profiles of Mitsubishi A6M0s, the legendary fighter planes that had, for the initial 2 years of the conflict, reigned supreme over the Pacific skies. These aircraft were renowned for their exceptional speed, remarkable maneuverability, and were piloted by individuals who had undergone years of rigorous training prior to the outbreak of hostilities. Intelligence reports indicated that the Japanese forces maintained a formidable contingent of approximately 400 fighter aircraft stationed in the northern Solomons. It became starkly evident that a substantial portion of this formidable aerial armada was being dispatched to intercept Old 666. The inaugural Zero launched its assault at precisely 0907 hours, executing a classic dive from above and behind, the quintessential attack vector employed against bomber formations. The enemy pilot initiated his firing sequence at a range of approximately 400 yards, close enough for the tail gunner to discern the luminous arcs of tracer rounds hurtling towards the B-17's rear. Tail gunner Herbert Pugh retaliated instantly, his dual .50 caliber machine guns unleashing a torrent of rounds at an astonishing rate of 800 rounds per minute. The Zero abruptly disengaged. Whether this withdrawal was prompted by inflicted damage or mere prudence remained indeterminate. However, In its wake, a trio of additional Zeros materialized, launching synchronized attacks from divergent angles. The ensuing aerial combat, though lasting a mere 13 minutes by the clock, was perceived by the beleaguered crew of Old 666 as an agonizing span of hours compressed into fleeting seconds. The Japanese aviators were exceptionally skilled, representing some of the most proficient pilots within their respective air groups. They had meticulously devised specialized tactics specifically tailored for engaging B-17s, meticulously coordinating their approaches to strike from multiple directions simultaneously, thereby intending to overwhelm the bomber's defensive armaments. Against a conventional B-17 staffed by a standard crew, these sophisticated tactics typically yielded success. Yet, Old 666 was far from a conventional aircraft, and her crew was equally extraordinary. Thanks to Zemer's ingenious modifications, every gun position boasted interlocking fields of fire. Consequently, Zeros attacking from the stern encountered a barrage of fire emanating from the tail guns, both waist guns, and the dorsal turret. Assaults from below were met by the supplementary ventral gun that Zemer had personally installed. Frontal engagements were confronted not solely by Sarnowski's nose gun, but also by the reinforced forward firing positions. The bomber vibrated violently under the sustained recoil of 19.50 caliber machine guns discharging in a staggered sequence. Sped brass casings accumulated rapidly on the aircraft's floor. The internal temperature soared beyond 100 degrees Fahrenheit, solely due to the intense heat generated by the continuous firing. Gunners vociferously relayed target acquisitions, issued urgent warnings, and reported damage, all while the aircraft bucked and shuddered from repeated impacts. Zemer piloted the colossal bomber with an astonishing grace, akin to a meticulously choreographed dance, executing subtle adjustments to its flight path. These maneuvers were never so pronounced as to jeopardize the integrity of the photographic run, yet they were precisely sufficient to disrupt the enemy's aim by fractions of a degree, a critical difference that often determined between a direct hit and a near miss. Throughout this intense ballet of evasion and defense, the specialized cameras continued their ceaseless operation. Joe Sarnowski, steadfast at his station in the nose compartment, meticulously adjusted camera settings, swiftly exchanged film magazines, and painstakingly ensured that every single photograph captured would possess optimal sharpness and utility, for this was the paramount objective of their mission. This was the sole reason for their audacious presence. The relentless waves of Zeros persisted in their assaults, and Old 660 SIX's dwindling fortune began to wane. At 9:12, a devastating 20mm cannon shell catastrophically pierced the cockpit windscreen and detonated explosively within the confines of the flight deck. Shrapnel lacerated the intricate instrument panel, severing vital control cables, and obliterating half of the crucial gauges upon which Zemer critically depended. A searing piece of molten metal, roughly the size of a quarter, embedded itself agonizingly into Zemer's right arm. Another fragment inflicted a grievous gash across his leg. Blood rapidly saturated his flight suit, yet he maintained an unyielding grip on the control yoke. The resilient bomber, against all odds, continued its flight. The cameras, with unwavering resolve, continued their operation. All other considerations were unequivocally secondary. Within the cramped confines of the nose compartment, Joe Sarnowski had just concluded the swift replacement of a film magazine when a Zero, with terrifying resolve, bore down directly upon them, head-on, its guns blazing ferociously. This was the precise form of attack that bomber crews dreaded most acutely. Frontal assaults afforded gunners only a precious few seconds to react before the agile fighter streaked past. Sarnowski, with a surge of adrenaline, swung his .50 caliber machine gun forward and unleashed a torrent of fire, meticulously walking his tracer rounds into the Zero's engine cowling. The Japanese fighter convulsed violently, spewing forth a plume of smoke, but not before its synchronized guns raked the B-17's nose with a devastating spray of bullets. Sarnowski recoiled sharply, having sustained multiple catastrophic impacts to his abdomen and chest. The wounds were undeniably fatal. Any medical professional would have instantly recognized the grim prognosis. These were injuries from which there was no recovery. Sarnowski, with a chilling clarity, understood this harsh reality as well. He could feel his life force rapidly ebbing with each weakening heartbeat. However, his formidable gun remained fully operational, and more enemy Zeros were inexorably aligning themselves for subsequent attack runs. Consequently, he neither succumbed to the urge to lie down, nor did he issue a desperate plea for assistance, nor did he engage in any of the actions for which a dying man might justifiably be pardoned. Instead, with an astonishing display of fortitude, he gripped the gun's handles with unwavering resolve, braced his weakening body against the navigator's table, and continued to pour forth a relentless stream of suppressive fire. When yet another Zero flashed past the nose, Sarnowski's meticulously aimed burst intercepted it with lethal precision, sending the stricken aircraft spiraling uncontrollably into the vast expanse of the ocean below. This marked his third confirmed kill of the harrowing engagement, and he would manage to shoot down one more enemy aircraft before his body finally succumbed to the profound and overwhelming injuries. In the rear section of the embattled aircraft, the waist gunners were grappling with their own escalating crisis. The cunning Zero pilots had astutely deduced that old 660 SIX's most formidable concentration of defensive firepower was situated towards the stern and flanks, prompting them to adapt their tactics by initiating attacks from below and ahead, angles where the bomber's defensive guns possessed significantly reduced coverage. Waist gunner William Vaughan, with courageous determination, leaned precariously out into the roaring slipstream, battling against the formidable force of 200 miles per hour winds, endeavoring to bring his weapon to bear upon a Zero executing an underneath pass. A sudden, savage burst of 7.7 mm rounds stitched a deadly pattern across his position, and he felt distinct impacts, one striking his shoulder, another grazing his skull. The world swam in a crimson haze, and dizziness threatened to overwhelm him, yet he steadfastly remained at his gun. Herbert Pugh, ensconced in the tail section, had been discharging his weapons almost without cessation for a grueling 8 minutes. The barrels of his machine guns had become so intensely hot that they had begun to emit a foreboding, cherry-red glow within the dim confines of the tail compartment. Ammunition reserves were critically dwindling. He had expended nearly 1,500 rounds, and the remaining ammunition belts were noticeably shortening. A Zero executed a high-side pass, and Pugh, with remarkable precision, tracked its trajectory flawlessly, leading the target just enough to accurately compensate for its formidable speed and approach angle. His meticulously aimed rounds climbed the fighter's fuselage, finding their mark directly in the cockpit. The Zero abruptly inverted and plunged away, leaving a fiery trail in its wake. This brought the tail gunner's tally to 4 confirmed kills, though he had long since ceased the act of counting. There seemed to be an inexhaustible supply of enemy aircraft. Co-pilot John Britton had sustained multiple shrapnel wounds in both legs when a 20 mm shell detonated with concussive force against the robust armor-plating position directly behind his seat, the very same supplementary armor that Zimmer had installed, defying existing regulations. While the reinforced metal had successfully absorbed the brunt of the fragments, enough had penetrated to inflict severe damage. Britton's flight suit was thoroughly saturated with his own blood, and every minute movement sent fresh, agonizing waves of pain coursing through his body. He glanced towards Zimmer, observing the captain slumped forward, barely clinging to consciousness, and a chilling realization dawned upon him. Their predicament had just become immeasurably worse. Should Zimmer completely lose consciousness, Britain would be compelled to pilot Old 666 back to base, despite suffering injuries that, under ordinary circumstances, would have necessitated immediate hospitalization. The dorsal turret gunner, Johnny Abel, had been struck in the hand, tragically losing 2 fingers to a searing 20mm fragment. With astonishing resilience, he improvised a bandage using a torn piece of his own shirt and continued to fire one-handed, employing his knee to help stabilize the formidable weapon. Radio operator Forrest Dillman, whose usual combat responsibilities were considerably more limited, had resourcefully seized one of the spare machine guns and was now firing through an open window, thereby augmenting the aircraft's collected defensive fire. Even navigator Ruby Johnston, in the fleeting moments when he wasn't meticulously plotting their most viable escape route, was actively engaged in feeding ammunition belts to the beleaguered gunners and vociferously calling out the constantly shifting positions of the enemy fighters. At 9:15, precisely 7 minutes into the relentless engagement, with the crucial photographic run finally completed, Zimmer at last uttered the words that every member of the crew had been desperately yearning to hear. "Photo's done. We're getting out of here." With a decisive motion, he pushed the control yoke forward, causing Old 660 SIX's nose to dip and consequently increasing its airspeed. While the heavy bomber could never truly outrun the agile Zeros, indeed, no aircraft could, every additional mile per hour significantly complicated the enemy's targeting calculations. The Japanese pilots, observing their prey attempting to disengage and escape, intensified their attacks with even greater aggression. They were acutely aware of the Americans' wounded state and could visually discern the extensive damage, the telltale smoke trailing from the No. 3 engine, the numerous pieces of aluminum skin torn away from the fuselage. Yet, Old 666 was retaliating with every ounce of its remaining might. The defensive fire never wavered, never slackened. Zimmer's foresightful modifications meant they still possessed a critical supply of ammunition at a point when other bombers would have been rendered utterly defenseless. And the Zeros, after 13 grueling minutes of relentlessly attacking what should have been an easily vanquished target, had suffered significant losses, with at least 5 aircraft confirmed destroyed and several others evidently damaged. The seasoned Japanese pilots were experienced enough to recognize, when the escalating cost of the engagement began to unequivocally outweigh any potential gain. Consequently, at approximately 9:20, they abruptly broke off their sustained attack, turning their aircraft back towards the relative safety of their home bases. Within the battered shell of Old 666, no exultant shouts pierced the air. The crew members were too profoundly engaged in grappling with their grievous wounds. The eerie stillness that descended after the Japanese Zeros finally disengaged proved, in many ways, more profoundly unsettling than the frenetic combat itself. As the cacophony of gunfire ceased, and the engines settled back into their customary hum, the airmen could distinctly hear the wind howling through myriad perforations riddling the fuselage. An ominous clatter emanated from the No. 3 engine, which had absorbed multiple impacts, and was now generating a disturbing tremor rather than its vital propulsive power. Amidst these mechanical laments, they could discern their own ragged breathing, the persistent trickle of vital hydraulic liquid, and, beneath it all, the quiet, chilling sounds of men confronting the stark reality of their injuries. Pilot Zimmer endeavored to take stock of his aircraft's condition, but his grim inventory yielded nothing reassuring. He retained only a tenuous grip on the controls. The rudder proved unresponsive, moving with a ponderous reluctance, and while the ailerons, though functional, demanded a doubled effort, the trim tabs were utterly obliterated. A significant portion of the instrument panel lay shattered or displayed wildly erroneous data. The airspeed gauge had vanished entirely, the altimeter face bore a spiderweb of cracks, its readings potentially deceptive, and the hydraulic pressure gauge stubbornly registered naught. This last detail portended a formidable challenge for the deployment of the landing gear and flaps whenever they might reach Port Moresby. Should they even achieve Port Moresby, they remained a daunting 600 nautical miles from their base, and Ziemer, disoriented by trauma, found his sense of bearing utterly compromised, unsure of their homeward vector. He desperately endeavored to ascertain their geographical coordinates, to consult the navigation charts, but his sight repeatedly swam into an indistinct haze. The laceration on his leg continued its relentless seepage of blood, and the tendrils of awareness seemed to recede, eluding his grasp like water trickling through open palms. He violently dislodged his head, then clamped his teeth down on his tongue with such ferocity that a metallic taste of blood filled his mouth, employing any desperate measure to maintain lucidity. It was then that he heard Britton's voice. Though taught with evident agony, it resonated with unwavering resolve. "Jay, allow me to take command for a moment. You critically need to staunch that bleeding." Ziemer's instinct was to protest, to cling stubbornly to command, but his inherent pragmatism compelled him to acknowledge the imminent threat of unconsciousness. He offered a concise nod, relinquished his grip on the flight stick, and permitted his co-pilot to assume control. John Britton was now navigating the crippled aircraft through sheer force of will. His own lower limb injuries were considerably graver than he had disclosed to anyone, and each subtle adjustment to the control column sent searing pangs of anguish coursing through his hips and spinal column. Nevertheless, Ziemer's critical condition demanded immediate therapeutic intervention, and the remaining airmen were too incapacitated to offer meaningful assistance. Britton, with stoic determination, maintained the bomber's precarious equilibrium, while Ziemer fashioned a makeshift ligature, a strip torn from his flight attire, and tied a tourniquet around his own leg. It was a rudimentary, improvised medical intervention, yet it stemmed the copious hemorrhage sufficiently to secure a temporary reprieve. In the forward nose compartment, they had discovered Joe Sarnoski inert, collapsed over his weapon, his consciousness finally extinguished by the profound depletion of his vital fluids. Navigator Ruby Johnston scrambled towards the nose, his grim premonition already confirming the tragic prognosis. Sarnoski's respirations were faint and erratic, and his pulse barely registered, a feeble, fluttering thread. Johnston lacked formal medical expertise beyond rudimentary emergency care, but his grim experience with countless battle casualties rendered him acutely aware of the telltale signs of fatal injuries. His options were tragically limited to alleviating Sarnoski's suffering as best he could, clinging to the desperate hope that the gunner might endure until comprehensive medical attention could be administered. Johnston enveloped him in every spare garment and insulating covering at hand, endeavoring to stave off the full, debilitating onset of physiological shock. The radio system, though compromised, was still capable of intermittent operation. Forrest Dillman succeeded in relaying a concise message to Port Moresby, apprising the base of their mission's successful culmination, their current proceeding toward their home base, their suffering from numerous wounded personnel, and their requiring the immediate deployment of emergency medical vehicles upon their arrival. The return transmission was obscured by a cacophony of atmospheric interference, but Dillman perceived what he believed to be a confirmation. Nevertheless, the actual presence of awaiting emergency personnel remained a matter of grave conjecture. Conventional protocols dictated that an aircraft suffering such extensive incapacitation was generally considered unlikely to return, necessitating preparations for the most somber outcome. Ruby Johnston meticulously labored over his navigational charts, his hands trembling involuntarily. He had sustained an injury to his shoulder, a fact he had stoically kept concealed from his comrades. Even under optimal circumstances, dead reckoning navigation represented a delicate blend of precise mathematical computation and informed conjecture. With compromised instrumentation, unpredictable atmospheric currents, and the inability to precisely verify their speed over the ground, Johnston found himself relying primarily on intuitive judgment and fervent hope to guide their course. He provided Britain with a specific directional bearing of 185 degrees, instructing him to maintain it for the ensuing 60 minutes. Should Johnston's intricate computations prove accurate, this trajectory would propel them southward, towards the expansive Solomon Sea, safely distant from any Japanese-controlled zones. Conversely, an error in his calculations could lead them directly over an active enemy aerodrome, exposing them to renewed peril. Zeamer recovered his faculties approximately 20 minutes later and resumed command of the bomber's controls from his co-pilot, Britton. The co-pilot offered no dissent, as he himself was teetering on the brink of collapse. They established an arduous rotation, exchanging command every quarter hour or so, the individual least incapacitated by impending unconsciousness assuming the yoke, while the other sought a fleeting moment of recuperation. This was a method utterly contrary to the prescribed operational procedures for piloting multi-engine bombers found in any aviation manual. Indeed, no aspect of their current desperate predicament was detailed within the confines of standard flight doctrine. The number 3 engine ultimately ceased functioning entirely at approximately 10:30 hours, its demise marked by a cacophonous, grinding shriek that reverberated ominously throughout the aircraft's skeletal structure. Zeamer swiftly adjusted the propeller blades to minimize drag and cut off the fuel supply to the ailing engine. Old 666 possessed the capability to remain airborne with only 3 operational engines, albeit with extreme difficulty. Consequently, their operational altitude began an inexorable decline, 25,000 feet, then 20,000, then 15,000. Each decrement of 1,000 feet in elevation amplified the inherent danger of encountering enemy reconnaissance or patrol aircraft. However, the immutable laws of physics remained indifferent to their perilous circumstances. The heavily damaged bomber continued its downward trajectory, irrespective of the crew's preferences or desperate hopes. Around 11:30, they traversed what Navigator Johnston meticulously computed as the precise halfway mark of their arduous journey, with 300 miles of perilous sky now behind them, and an equivalent distance still stretching ahead. The crew had concluded the rudimentary self-administered medical attention available to them, which primarily comprised hastily applied bandages and makeshift tourniquets. The fact that every man remained alive constituted what could only be described as a minor, yet profound, miracle. Yet, to preserve their lives for the ensuing 3 hours demanded that old 666 defy every rational expectation of mechanical integrity. The bomber was copiously expelling vital hydraulic fluid, seeping precious fuel from its compromised tanks, shuddering violently due to its impaired control surfaces, and sustained in the air by the precarious function of 3 ailing engines and an indomitable will. The beleaguered crew placed their unwavering faith in Zeamer. Zeamer, in turn, reposed his confidence in the very aircraft he had meticulously reconstructed with his own skilled hands, and thus, somewhere above the vast expanse of the Solomon Sea, battered, bleeding, and profoundly damaged, they collectively pressed onward, resolute in their flight toward home. To grasp the profound motivation that propelled Zimmer and his courageous crew to embark upon what was universally acknowledged as a suicidal undertaking, it is imperative to comprehend the critical significance these invaluable reconnaissance photographs held for the overarching Pacific campaign. Their perilous endeavor was not driven by a pursuit of individual acclaim or a display of imprudent bravado. The vital photographic intelligence secured by Old 666, presently ensconced within its magazines in the bomber's forward compartment, safeguarded by the inert form of Joe Sarnoski, held within its frames data that possessed the direct potential to preserve countless lives and fundamentally alter the strategic landscape within the Solomon Islands archipelago. The ambitious Operation Cartwheel represented General Douglas MacArthur's meticulously conceived strategy to effectively incapacitate the formidable Japanese stronghold at Rabaul, thereby circumventing the necessity of a direct, costly frontal assault. The underlying strategic premise was remarkably sophisticated: to systematically seize or render inoperable the various enemy airfields encircling Rabaul, thereby severing its critical logistical arteries and aerial defensive capabilities until the base itself was strategically marginalized. Such an intricate strategy, however, necessitated an exceptionally comprehensive understanding of Japanese military dispositions across the entire Solomon Islands chain. Precise locations of enemy aerodromes were paramount. Their operational capacity, specifically the number of aircraft they could accommodate, was crucial. Optimal ingress routes for naval artillery bombardments needed to be identified, and safe landing zones for Allied ground forces were essential. These critical inquiries could not be adequately addressed through mere speculation or obsolete intelligence assessments. Instead, they unequivocally demanded up-to-the-minute, high-resolution aerial photographic intelligence. The precise geographical region targeted by Zimmer for photographic reconnaissance, encompassing Buka and Bougainville, held paramount strategic importance due to its pivotal location directly athwart the vital logistical artery connecting Rabaul with the Japanese forces stationed in the southern Solomon Islands. Earlier intelligence briefings indicated that Japanese forces were actively engaged in expanding existing airfields on Buka and constructing novel installations at various sites across Bougainville. However, mere suggestions from intelligence communiques were wholly insufficient for the exacting demands of comprehensive operational planning. General MacArthur's operational staff required absolute precision, exact geographical coordinates, precise runway dimensions, an accurate count and classification of anti-aircraft emplacements, the precise placement of fuel storage depots, and a multitude of other granular details that could exclusively be furnished by high-resolution aerial imagery. Prior endeavors to photograph these critical enemy installations had regrettably met with failure, either due to an inability to approach sufficiently close or having been aggressively repelled by Japanese interceptors before achieving comprehensive photographic coverage. Beyond the strategic imperative, a pressing, immediate humanitarian concern underscored the urgency of this perilous mission. A distressing total of 9 Allied bomber crews, collectively comprising approximately 90 airmen, were at that very moment either adrift in the unforgiving waters or concealed on various diminutive islands scattered across the Bougainville region. These brave individuals had been down during preceding bombing sorties, conducted over the course of the preceding 3 weeks. A portion had managed to reach desolate, uninhabited islets, where they now awaited the prospect of rescue, while others sought refuge on islands under Japanese occupation, relying precariously on the benevolence of indigenous inhabitants to shield them from vigilant enemy patrols. The Allied naval forces possessed both submarines and PBY Catalina flying boats, assets capable of undertaking such precarious rescue operations. However, the efficacy of these rescue efforts hinged entirely on precise intelligence regarding the operational zones of Japanese patrol vessels, the specific islands harboring enemy garrisons, and the identification of relatively secure ingress and egress routes. The invaluable photographic intelligence meticulously acquired by Zimmer would furnish precisely this critical data. These high-altitude images possess the capability to graphically delineate Japanese naval patrol routes, pinpoint the exact positions of formidable coastal artillery emplacements, and clearly distinguish between heavily monitored beaches and those sufficiently isolated for surreptitious extraction operations. Back at Port Moresby, dedicated intelligence analysts were already meticulously arranging their workstations, poised to commence the development of the photographic film the instant Old 666 made its triumphant return. Mere hours after the development process, they would possess the comprehensive intelligence essential for meticulously planning these vital rescue operations. And within a matter of days, Allied submarines would be dispatched towards designated pickup locations, areas that, prior to this mission, had been deemed prohibitively perilous for any approach. The strategic significance of the mission extended far beyond the immediate goal of locating downed airmen. The visual intelligence gathered would meticulously document the Japanese military's progress on the construction of new airfields, providing Allied planners with critical insights into the necessary pace for Operation Cartwheel. Should the enemy forces be nearing the completion of these vital new runways, it would necessitate a complete reevaluation and acceleration of the entire campaign timeline. Furthermore, these invaluable images would pinpoint the precise locations of essential supply dumps, strategic ammunition storage areas, and key headquarters buildings, all of which represented high-priority targets for subsequent bombing raids. Concurrently, naval intelligence units would leverage the detailed coastal photographs to meticulously update existing charts and identify potential anchorages crucial for supporting future invasion operations. Beyond the quantifiable military objectives, a profound morale factor resonated throughout the Allied forces, a sentiment rarely explicitly documented in official military reports. Air crews across the vast Pacific theater were acutely aware of the perilous situation facing those 9 downed crews awaiting rescue. They understood the grim reality that rescue operations pending often served as a euphemism for presumed lost, whenever the tactical circumstances rendered recovery attempts excessively perilous. The military's demonstrable commitment to deploying aircraft and risking precious resources to retrieve these men, to bring them safely home, conveyed an unequivocal message to every pilot and crew member in the theater. We do not abandon our people. This deeply held conviction was of paramount importance in a campaign where air crews routinely faced casualty rates ranging from 30 to 40%. The knowledge that their service would dispatch assistance, even deep within hostile territory, provided the psychological fortitude necessary to continue ascending into their aircraft day after day. The photographic intelligence acquired on June 16, 1943, underwent immediate and rigorous analysis, subsequently being catalogued as Intelligence Report 447B. Specific segments of this report were promptly disseminated to naval commanders actively engaged in planning the pivotal invasion of New Georgia slated for July. Other critical sections were instrumental in shaping the Marine landing at Bougainville itself in November 1943. Air Force targeting officers would continue to utilize these images for planning bombing raids well into 1944. Such was the revelatory nature of some of these images, detailing Allied reconnaissance capabilities and sophisticated photo interpretation techniques, that they remained classified until the 1970s. Yet, on that fateful day, amidst the pain of their wounds and the desperate struggle to keep Old 666 aloft, Zimmer and his courageous crew were driven by the singular understanding that the film magazines within their aircraft held information worth dying for. They could not have foreseen the multitude of future operations that would ultimately hinge upon their photographs. They were unaware that their efforts would directly contribute to the rescue of 87 of those 90 stranded airmen. Their sole knowledge was that other men relied upon them to complete their mission and safely deliver the crucial photographs. That understanding was sufficient. It had always been sufficient. Old 666, a battered and defiant sentinel, finally limped over the airfield at Port Moresby at precisely 14:10 hours, nearly 5 arduous hours after its initial takeoff. Ground crews, observing the bomber's approach, instantly recognized the signs of a catastrophic ordeal. The aircraft conspicuously trailed smoke from multiple points, flying at a dangerously low altitude of barely 8,000 feet, when its operational ceiling should have been closer to 15,000. Moreover, its approach path was alarmingly erratic, a flight pattern strongly indicative of severe control system malfunctions or an incapacitated pilot. The control tower, recognizing the dire situation, immediately cleared all other air traffic and dispatched emergency vehicles to the runway. Ambulances, fire trucks, and specialized crash crews swiftly positioned themselves along the tarmac, bracing for the grim possibility of a crash landing. Captain Zimmer faced the monumental task of manually lowering the landing gear, as the aircraft's hydraulic system had been rendered entirely inoperable. This arduous process required his and Britain's combined effort on the hand crank for nearly 10 agonizing minutes, both men gritting their teeth against the excruciating pain of their injuries. When the gear finally clicked into its locked position, they possessed no reliable means of verifying that all 3 wheels were correctly deployed, relying solely on tactile feedback and a fervent hope that the indicator lights were not malfunctioning. The flaps presented an equally perilous challenge, jammed in a partial deployment, which inevitably meant the bomber's landing speed would be dangerously high, far exceeding safe parameters. Zimmer skillfully brought the heavily damaged bomber in at an astonishingly high speed, touching down at nearly 140 miles per hour, a full 50 miles per hour above the standard 90 miles per hour. Old 666 bounced violently upon impact, momentarily settled, then bounced once more before finally remaining firmly on the ground, rolling the entire length of the runway before Zimmer, with a final surge of strength, managed to bring the aircraft to a complete stop. Medics, already poised, swarmed the aircraft even before its propellers ceased their rotation. They discovered all 10 men aboard, every single one of them suffering from various wounds. Zimmer and Britain, utterly spent, had to be physically extracted from the cockpit. Both had essentially lost consciousness the very moment they relinquished control of the aircraft. The waist gunners could barely stand or walk unaided. The tail gunner bore visible powder burns across his face, a testament to his prolonged and relentless firing of his weapons within the cramped confines of his station. Tragically, in the nose compartment, they found Joe Sarnowski, who had succumbed to his injuries somewhere over the Solomon Sea, likely around 10 o'clock hours, still slumped gallantly over his gun position. He had steadfastly remained at his post, fighting valiantly for 3 hours after sustaining wounds that, by all medical accounts, should have claimed his life within minutes. The photographs, the precious cargo of their harrowing mission, were developed with utmost urgency. Intelligence officers toiled tirelessly through the night of June 16th and into the morning of June 17th, producing comprehensive analysis reports even as Zimmer and his crew underwent critical surgery and received medical treatment. The quality of the images was deemed extraordinary, crisp, remarkably clear, and revealing every minute detail Allied planners required. One could distinctly count individual aircraft positioned at Kahili Airfield. The construction progress on new revetments and taxiways was plainly visible. Coastal gun positions were clearly delineated, along with their projected firing arcs. Japanese patrol boat anchorages were precisely marked for future reference. The resulting analyst reports, a testament to the detail captured, spanned over 200 pages, meticulously cross-referenced and annotated before being distributed to multiple command centers. Within a mere 48 hours, the inaugural rescue operation, directly informed by the intelligence gleaned from old 660 SIXS photographs, was launched. A Navy submarine successfully picked up 6 downed airmen from a remote island that the detailed photographs had confirmed was entirely unoccupied by Japanese forces. Over the ensuing 3 weeks, a series of meticulously coordinated operations resulted in the triumphant rescue of 87 of the 90 stranded men. Sadly, 3 had already perished from their injuries or had been captured before rescue efforts could reach them, but 87 came home. These rescued airmen understood implicitly the reason for their salvation. Word spread like wildfire among the Pacific air crews about the audacious mission that had so accurately mapped enemy positions, thereby making these crucial pickups possible. Recommendations for valorous medals commenced immediately. Ziemers, commanding officer, who had harbored grave doubts of ever seeing any of his crew alive again, drafted the initial citations on June 18, even as his pilots were still undergoing surgery. The award swiftly navigated through official channels with an unprecedented pace. By July, the decisions were unequivocally finalized. Captain J. Ziemer Jr. was designated to receive the Medal of Honor, recognizing his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty. Second Lieutenant Joseph Sarnowski was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor for his conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, demonstrating an extraordinary risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. It was an exceptionally rare occurrence for 2 individuals from the same crew to be bestowed with the Medal of Honor for a single action, having transpired only a handful of times throughout American military history. The remaining members of the intrepid crew, co-pilot John Britton, navigator Ruby Johnston, bombardier George Kendrick, who would later replace Sarnowski on subsequent missions, engineer Johnny Abel, radio operator Forrest Dillman, and gunners Herbert Pugh, William Vaughn, and Bud Thursday, each received the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second-highest military decoration. Every single man aboard that aircraft was honored with one of the top 2 awards for valor, a phenomenon previously unheard of within the Army Air Forces. This complete crew, with every member recognized with either the Medal of Honor or Distinguished Service Cross for a solitary mission, powerfully underscored the unprecedented nature of their actions and the critical contribution each individual had made. Captain Ziemer endured a 3-month period of intensive recovery from his severe wounds. The injuries to his leg and arm necessitated multiple intricate surgeries, and medical professionals initially expressed concerns that he might never be able to fly again. However, he defied these expectations, returning to limited flight duty in late 1943, although he was never cleared for combat operations again due to the extensive damage his body had sustained. Britain, in contrast, made a full recovery and continued to fly combat missions until the cessation of the war. The gunners, upon healing, rejoined their respective squadrons. The majority survived the war, though some regrettably did not, a stark illustration of the brutal mathematics inherent in the Pacific Air Campaign. Remarkably, Old 666 also took to the skies once more. Maintenance crews dedicated weeks to meticulously repairing the extensive battle damage, replacing hundreds of feet of critical control cables, painstakingly patching structural members, and installing an entirely new nose section. The venerable bomber returned to active service, continuing to fly reconnaissance missions for another year before finally being retired and subsequently scrapped in late 1944. By that time, she had accumulated more combat hours and survived more structural damage than almost any other B-17 in the unforgiving Pacific theater. The enduring narrative of Old 666 transcended mere medals and hospital beds. The extraordinary accomplishments of Ziemer and his crew on June 16, 1943, fundamentally reshaped the Army Air Force's approach to reconnaissance missions, aircraft modifications, and the intricate relationship between individual initiative and overall military effectiveness. The profound lessons gleaned from that singular, pivotal flight permeated air doctrine for many years thereafter, influencing everything from bomber design principles to rigorous crew training protocols and sophisticated mission planning strategies. Firstly, the mission exerted an immediate and tangible tactical impact. Prior to Old 660 SIX's audacious flight, photo reconnaissance deep within enemy territory was considered so inherently perilous that crews were permitted to decline such assignments without incurring any formal penalty. The prevailing unofficial policy was to solicit volunteers and accept a refusal without question, primarily because compelling men to undertake what was universally dubbed suicide missions proved detrimental to both morale and operational effectiveness. However, Ziemer's mission unequivocally demonstrated that with the appropriate aircraft modifications, thorough crew training, and a meticulously crafted tactical approach, even heavily defended targets could be successfully photographed, challenging pre-existing notions of feasibility and risk. Within a matter of weeks following the remarkable mission, the command structure of the 5th Air Force promulgated revised directives for reconnaissance aircraft, specifically recommending the integration of additional defensive armament. This effectively formalized the ingenious modifications Ziemer had independently engineered. These profound engineering alterations extended far beyond the mere addition of supplementary machine guns. Ziemer's implementation of reinforced armor plating, his strategic repositioning of ammunition storage for superior weight distribution, and his meticulously enhanced interlocking fields of fire were not arbitrary adjustments. Instead, they signified a comprehensive reimagining of how a bomber ought to be configured for the specialized demands of reconnaissance operations, distinctly different from conventional bombing sorties. Photographs illustrating Old 660 SIX's innovative modifications were presented to Boeing engineers, and subsequently, discernible elements of Ziemer's pioneering design were incorporated into later variants of the B-17 Flying Fortress and significantly improved the defensive systems of the B-24 Liberator. The foundational principle that reconnaissance aircraft must possess the capability to actively engage and fight their way out of perilous situations, rather than merely relying on evasive maneuvers, thus became deeply integrated into established Air Force doctrine. Beyond the technical innovations, military analysts meticulously scrutinized the profound human element embedded within this extraordinary narrative. A central question emerged: how did a crew, largely comprised of individuals who had been overlooked, underestimated, or otherwise marginalized, manage to outperform more celebrated and established units when confronted with the gravest of stakes? The compelling answer appeared to reside in Ziemer's astute methodology for assembling his cohesive team. He deliberately eschewed selecting pilots with the most impressive efficiency ratings or gunners laden with the highest decorations. Instead, he sought out men who were undeniably competent, yet possessed an insatiable drive to distinguish themselves, who fostered an unshakable trust in one another, and who had undergone extensive, rigorous training together. Prior to embarking on the perilous Buka mission, they had already completed dozens of intricate mapping flights, a shared experience that meticulously forged the unparalleled coordination and communication skills that often proved elusive for more prestigious crews. This impactful revelation profoundly influenced crew assignment policies throughout the duration of the war. Rather than the previous practice of continually rotating personnel to bridge gaps or compensate for losses, commanding officers began to prioritize keeping successful crews intact for extended periods, recognizing that profound unit cohesion served as a potent combat multiplier. The airmen aboard Old 666 possessed an intimate familiarity with each other's voices, could instinctively anticipate one another's actions, and maintained an unwavering conviction that every member would diligently execute their duties, even amidst the most catastrophic circumstances. This profound reservoir of trust was painstakingly cultivated over many months of shared flight experiences, and could not be artificially replicated by the simplistic act of assigning individually skilled personnel to fill vacant positions on a crew roster. Furthermore, the mission itself evolved into a compelling case study illuminating the intricacies of leadership when operating under conditions of extreme duress. Zimmer's critical decision-making processes during the intense aerial engagement, his resolute commitment to completing the photographic run despite enduring relentless enemy attacks, his incredible tenacity in maintaining consciousness through severe, life-threatening wounds to pilot the damaged aircraft homeward, and his judicious decision to transfer control to Lieutenant Britton when his own physical capacities were failing, all became exemplary teaching illustrations at elite pilot training schools. These were not presented as fantastical tales of superhuman endurance, but rather as pragmatic demonstrations of how effective leaders formulate calculated, strategic decisions even when confronted with a spectrum of unequivocally terrible options. Zimmer did not vanquish 17 Japanese fighter aircraft through sheer individual combat prowess. He triumphed over them by steadfastly refusing to countenance the failure of the mission, and by placing absolute confidence in his crew to execute their vital responsibilities, while he expertly discharged his own. For the families of the 87 airmen whose lives were ultimately saved, the unfolding narrative resonated with a far more profound and personal significance. Several of these rescued individuals subsequently completed their military tours and returned home, embarking on lives that would have been irrevocably extinguished had it not been for the crucial photographs secured by Old 666. Children were born who otherwise would never have existed. Businesses were established that would never have seen fruition. The profound ripple effects of preserving 87 human lives extended across multiple generations. Some of those fortunate rescued airmen maintained enduring contact with members of Zimmer's crew for the remainder of their days. Others, in a deeply personal tribute, honored Joe Sarnowski by naming their sons after him. The intricate mathematics of sacrifice and salvation defies neat calculation on any conventional ledger, yet the individuals directly involved intimately grasped the magnitude of what had been willingly given, and what had been miraculously preserved. J. Zimmer himself enjoyed a long life, passing away in 2007 at the venerable age of 88. He seldom spoke publicly about the harrowing mission, consistently redirecting any attention or accolades toward his dedicated crew whenever journalists inquired about his Medal of Honor. In his twilight years, he articulated a sentiment that beautifully encapsulated the fundamental essence of why seemingly ordinary individuals manage to achieve truly extraordinary feats. We just did what needed doing. Other people were depending on those photographs, and we had the aircraft and the crew to get them. It wasn't about being heroes. It was about not letting people down. That profound sentiment, the unwavering refusal to abandon a critical mission when the well-being and success of others are wholly dependent upon one's actions, ultimately represented the enduring, true legacy of Old 666. The bomber itself met an unceremonious end, dismantled for salvage metal in 1944 to contribute to the construction of other vital aircraft. Today, no physical fragments of Old 666 endure in museums. No commemorative physical memorial designates the precise location where Old 666 once rested on the sun-baked airfield at Port Moresby, yet the indispensable photographs captured on June 16, 1943, still exist, meticulously preserved within the hallowed halls of the National Archives, meticulously labeled and safeguarded in climate-controlled storage facilities. One can indeed submit a request to view them. It is possible to gaze upon the identical images that those discerning intelligence analysts scrutinized 8 decades ago, to trace the very same coastlines, and to meticulously count the very same aircraft. They are merely photographs now, venerable historical documents originating from a global conflict that concluded long before the vast majority of living people were born. Yet, there was a time when brave men bled profusely for those very images, when courageous men perished in their defense, and when countless other men now live their lives precisely because someone, against all odds, managed to bring them home.